Welcome, everybody. Welcome to a special, I want to say edition or a special, stream of game theory. And I'm very, very happy to talk about how we're having a conversation with some really wonderful folks and some folks who have been involved in things that we've talked about on stream and have, in fact, played games on stream with. And so with no further ado, I'd like to welcome to join me this evening, or this morning, in fact, where they are, Jacky Leung, the creative lead and project manager, Jazz Eisinger, the managing editor, and Caroline Amaba,
you nailed it.
The art director of the latest and certainly the much enjoyed release from Unbreakable Publishing called Unbreakable Revolution. The first anthology was released last year. This is the second main release, I think, and we did a substantial review of it last week on the stream. And so if you are interested in watching that review, now's a great time to keep watching. We're going to spend about 90 minutes to 2 hours or so. And so we're going to have a good conversation with these wonderful people about partly the process of what it is to actually create and put something out for the TTRPG community, especially something that is addressing such a broad, vibrant, and underserved part of the cultural myths and complexity that make up what it is to be us. That being said, welcome, Caroline, Jazz, and Jacky again. Please, if you don't mind, in that order, just introduce yourselves and how you like to be called, and a little bit about about yourselves, and also what kind of brought you into this project.
Hi, my name is Caroline. I am the art. I'm going to just recash everything. Art director on the Unbreakable team. I actually am a full-time software engineer and part-time a little bit of everything else. From I do a little bit of Twitch streaming. I do gaming, and then I got this. I got a lot of like TTRPG stuff. We're working with these wonderful fine folks here, based out of New York. What made me come onto the project? Well, I think Jacky and Jazz will go in depth about how it started, but they were looking for someone to do layout, and I was like, you know what, I'm down. So I sent them a very fun little resume of sorts as like a Google Deck, and then they emailed me back like, you got it. So that's how I got involved, and I started doing like TTRPG like stuff. I actually have my first thing I did was I wrote an adventure as part of the Uncaged anthologies by the wonderful Ashley Warren, who started that whole like feminist monster adventure one shots. So that's where I got my start in this little community. And I've kind of like, I haven't written or designed as much. I've mostly done like layout and like art directing for Unbreakable since then. That's where I'm at. I'll hand it off to Jazz.
Hey, it's me. I'm Jazz. I love working on Unbreakable, and I manage all of our editors, but I also was in Uncaged Volume 2 with non-binary merfolk. That was my jam. So you can find me there, which is also kind of how this got started, and I'll let Jacky talk about his part as well. But we had just finished the Uncaged panel at Gen Con 2018, I believe, maybe 2019.
It was 2019.
Was it 2019? Okay. So we had just finished the panel. The third volume of Uncaged was just being announced at that, and we all went to dinner afterwards. And I had helped put together that panel of Ashley and the art director and Kat Kruger and Jess, who ran the panel. And it was, we were all on like this wonderful, like, yeah, this is great. And then we went to the Ennies after that. But in between, we had this, everybody was starving because it's Gen Con. And so we all met up and we're like, what's next? What do we do next? And through a weird winding conversation, we ended up with, wouldn't it be great if there was an Asian setting actually written by folks who were Asian in D&D? And that's how Volume 1 started. And now we have 2 books with 3 more on the way, and so many more ideas for where we're going in the future. Outside of Unbreakable, I also do actual play podcasts. I pretend to play Ryutama every other week. We used to play Ryutama. Now we mostly just improv with some Ryutama roots. It's pretty great. I also do freelance editing, freelance writing, copywriting. I also design games. I'm in the TTRPG space a lot. Let's put it that way. Jacky, to you.
All right, sure. Hi, I'm Jacky. And I will say that for the most part, I am a full-time freelance TTRPG writer, editor, and designer. That is literally, I got to live the dream. I got to do this full-time. For the most part, a lot of my work has been started out in D&D 5e. I got into the early areas of the DM's Guild when it was pretty new. And I had a few decent bestsellers in the beginning, and then I got into also the Uncaged anthology as well. And I was in volume 3, and that one did win an Emmy. Yeah, I remember that dinner very well because there was about probably 5 tables of us that were in that one restaurant, and Jazz and I were sitting in the same table, and we were having in that conversation. We did eventually get into talking about doing some kind of an Asian setting, or at least something that, you know, featured more of Asian settings in general. And so when we started that whole concept early on, we organized some of the alumni from Uncaged, and then we also did a general open call for Asian writers and artists and things like that, because there wasn't enough representation in that space yet. And we wanted more of that, and then it morphed and became an Own Voices anthology, and then we then proceeded to start bringing in, like, organizing our writers, our artists at the time, and our editors. And after we launched it, we knew we were probably wanting to do more, but we weren't sure about how the scope was going to be at that time. And since then, my ambitions for making this into something more has gotten us into where we're going now.
Where you're going now is always a great question. You say you've got a whole 3 more on the way. Any sneak peeks and previews, or maybe do you want to save that till the end and we can kind of wrap up with
we can definitely talk about it, because I talked about it at Session ZeroCon earlier this year in January. And so basically we have 3 other books coming on the way. Unbreakable Revolution is one of our first new products featuring indie TTRPGs systems. And then we're doing another book called Pathways, which is also going to be focusing on indie TTRPGs as another anthology. But the themes for Pathways are going to deal with the interconnections of themes about family, traveling, and food. Because a large part of Asian culture is about food. And we wanted to do an anthology that focuses on those 3 kind of elements. So a lot of the adventures that we have seen and read and that we're reviewing right now, they're mostly focused on either the traveling aspect, maybe the family, or intermingling of the food. We encourage the food bit quite a bit more because we know how important it is for a lot of our respective cultures. And so we were very encouraging about that. We were like, there's not enough about talk about it.
I think that was, by the way, this is how this is going to be, by the way. Like, I'm going to interrupt randomly, and so you should all just interrupt randomly and just rock on with it, right? Because that's how it is. But one of the things when I was doing the review of it was I was just so pleased to see food and how central food was to some of the stories, because it was just so authentic, right? I can't imagine going to some auntie's house and not being force-fed laddu until I couldn't eat anymore, and not being told that no was not an acceptable term there. So, in the same way, it was just so nice that food was just so central. I think I'm talking about one of the specific adventures, I don't have the name to hand, where it actually starts and it's in the middle of the celebration, and so the food is it's a festival, and the food is so central there, and the art of that food is also adorable as well. And I think that so much of that is just spoke to me as just like, yes, this is a real thing, right? And I just want to echo how that's a pretty great choice.
We have a lot of wonderful food art coming in the next one. Let me just tell you, I was listening to your review of the last one, and I'm like, oh, if he loves the food here, he's gonna love that.
So same. I said, oh, you're gonna love all the food stories we're gonna have eventually.
We have one literally centered around durians coming up.
Well. We are a Singapore-based channel, so as a result, I can't claim to be one, but in our chat, I can already see there's a few folks in our chat who are Well, it's very specific about their durian. So I think that's a hard climb you picked there, but it's a wonderful thing. Wonderful thing. Sorry, please. So in the course of like the thematic thing you talked about in Pathways, a thing I wanted to bring up that I struggle with representation of in sort of Asianness in general, and I generally do. I want to come into this in a minute, but is the lack of any regard to the role of migration in human society, and how migration in human society is so important. And yet everybody in TTRPGs and everything else, I say this in generic kind of polemic statement, but traditionally in TTRPGs, when you represent different cultures, you represent them in a nice geographically contained border, sort of like the British tried to, and you sort of like draw a box around it, and you say this island here is the island of Indian people, and this island here is the island of Chinese people, and over here you have the island of people with katanas, and it's all kind of like nice and very, very enclosed and boxed in, and it doesn't in any way address the idea that cultural ideas, influences, food, beliefs, religion, the stuff that makes us who we are, is migratory. And our stories are migratory. I'm putting that out there as just to like get thoughts, issues, reflections.
So we actually have, because I think Jazz knows this better than I do. It's Rajiv's story, the yantra story we were talking about the other day. So Rajiv wrote another adventure with us, and that one actually deals with a yantra that takes place, that actually is is based off of an actual Hindu Buddhist pilgrimage, and it actually goes through several countries. So the entire process is actually intersectional through the cultures of those three countries as well in reflection, because it goes through India, China, and Tibet. And so when that pitch came to us, especially as it's developed, we've been very careful about how it's interpreted and how it's represented in the three different cultures that this pilgrimage actually goes through, especially in those countries, and plus, not to mention, it actually has a lot of intersection of different faiths as well, because it has intersections with Hinduism, Buddhism, and there's also a few other secular faiths that also interconnect with it. That is one of those things that when those kind of things do happen, we do try to take more special care, because those things can be very, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say fragile. Anyone want to help me out here?
I think
contentious.
Yeah, it's definitely something that like
contentious.
Yeah, it definitely is something that like we want to make sure it's represented truthfully, but also not harmfully, because there's truth in some of the actual literal contention between some of the things that happen. Like we saw this in like Revolution, that contention is like actually the biggest like through point, right? And all of that. So it's not that there isn't room for those things, but we want to make sure that they're handled properly. But in addition to that, I think, especially when it comes to like the whole, because like we have a lot of, and this is kind of just like a little bit of a bias because we're centered in the US, all of us. So we do have a lot more like diaspora. We're actually really happy with like a lot of the, we have a few global writers as well. I think primarily from the Philippines, but there's more people that are abroad. And I think our hope is that as we continue to grow our contributor base, and that we get these far reaching stories by literal, like the authors, not because like you're on the other side of the world, as proven now. Time is wild. It's for relative to us, it's going to be interesting, so we can get those more like transitory views, or just like the views that we don't typically see, and we want more of that. Like we understand it's actually hard to like capture like all of these like the gradients of Asian, right? It's not just like I'm Filipino American, and that's definitely different than like Filipino from the Philippines. So it's like I want to see that happen, and then especially a lot of like the cross, and I'm speaking specifically from like Filipino culture with like overseas workers. Like there's a variety of people that are Filipinos in different areas, and it'd be cool to try and capture that. It's almost an impossible task because there's so many, it's so diverse, and we're doing our best. And I think it would be great to see more folks come and join. And that's what we're hoping to attract more people as we do more projects.
I want to sort of pick up on a couple of interesting things that you mentioned there, and one of which is, I think Jacky kicked off with it, which is you mentioned I think you both did, the concept of Asianness. And I was very, very happy when I was doing the review of Revolution, because I have spent most of my adult life engaging in conversations that roughly go like this. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm Asian too. Oh, no, you're not Asian because you're from India. Well, I'm not from India, but put that aside, right? Oh, no. Okay, right, all right. So Asia is a geographic continent, and roughly it's this big, and it kind of arguably starts around the Bosphorus. So there's you get to have a west, east, and north and south view of Asia in the same way you get to have a west, east, north, and south view of Europe or any bloody where else, right? It's just cardinal directions. So it was really nice that there were two, I think at least, very Indian, cultural, and also artistic in terms of the geography, in terms of the way that the art captured the landscapes, and they were very reminiscent. I think that was very, very enjoyable. Now, how do you address that? Because in the US, where I've spent a bit of time, Asian doesn't mean South Asian. It means, primarily what many years ago would have been referred to as Oriental, which is still a term that's acceptable in some parts of the world, including this part of the world, amusingly enough, but very much isn't acceptable in the US. How do you sort of where do you draw the line, if you use the expression, or do you feel that drawing the line is even an appropriate concept?
What I do for the art matching, so we have artists that pitch their portfolios and we have writers. I will present all of the adventures to all of our artists who are also all Asian, of everywhere Asian. So we have people from India, we had people from all sorts of places. So I think when people read the pitches, we try not to fully classify everything as this is the one from India, this is the one from China. We try not to do that. We just try to present the story. And I think just a lot of the folks who identify as Indian and South Asian gravitated towards those stories, which I think lends for more authentic art. And I think that does come through in the way that and I'm so happy with the way you perceived it, because that's incredibly true. Now, I don't have exactly the amount of artists to only have Indian artists work on the Indian adventures. So the artists have also cross-pollinated their styles in a way. But the thing is, I think everyone that's part of the anthology is so proud of each other's cultures as well, that they will, work with their cohorts that are South Asian or Indian, and they will talk to the author who identifies as that culture. So I think a lot of the artists do really good homages to the cultures that they're trying to represent if they're not from that culture. And then if they are from that culture, it's incredibly authentic because it comes from this identifying place. And we found that very important because it adds to the work. I think a lot of us were blown away by the art. Our art was pretty good in volume 1, but we didn't have nearly as many artists the first time around. So I had to pull a lot from museum archives and open art and stuff like that. But now that I haven't used a single one in the next volumes because we have so many artists now, and it's so refreshing to see it's more now because of that connection that the artists have.
How did you sort of coordinate the editing or the work of people who are really speaking about 2.2 billion voices? I mean, where exactly is that sort of how do you draw that together into something coherent without it being, well, I don't know what the appropriate word is, I'm familiar, without it being ... and leave it there.
Right. So we have a slightly different editorial process than I think I've seen in many other anthologies, and that is we match an author with the writer at the time their pitch is accepted. So they have an editor with them throughout the entire process. So they have an editor with them to bounce ideas and have someone to go to that they can be do you, as a non-Asian person, do you understand this part? Or the editor can read it and go I love this, tell me more. And so they are matched throughout the process. About halfway through, we bring in a sensitivity reader.
For many of the folks, and I've had this question a few times, what is a sensitivity reader?
That's a great question. A sensitivity reader is someone that is comfortable reading an adventure, in this case, and saying, I understand this point of view, and I understand this culture. I understand this disability. I understand what you're trying to do here. Let me read it over for you as someone who lives from that perspective and make sure that things are using the correct terminology and making sure that it sounds authentic and doesn't hit a lot of the problematic things that we've seen in TTRPGs a lot of times. It won't necessarily be cultural. Most of Unbreakable sensitivity readers are cultural, but sometimes we have things with disability, or we have times where we're like, we've got multiple cultures represented. Let's make sure that it speaks to each of the cultures that are in that adventure. So I coordinate what that looks like, and that is an independent process. They're not involved with the author and editor ahead of time, so they're coming at it fresh and have an ability to say, yes, this is good representation, or no, this needs to be changed, and here's my suggestion. That's what a sensitivity reader does for most TTRPGs, and even in fiction, you'll see that as well. Yeah, and then after that point, the writer and editor can go back and say, okay, this feedback needs to be addressed. Here's how let's go about doing it. And then a second draft is produced. I call it the second draft. Sometimes it's the third, fourth, fifth draft for the writer. And at that point, it goes through proofing, and then it comes to me for what I call a consistency edit. So I make sure that, and I'm not really touching the cultural things, but sometimes I'll put in another content warning, or I'll put in a blurb on this spirit tries to jump into another character. Let's make sure that one of your boundaries at the table is not loss of bodily autonomy. We had that happen in one of the adventures in Revolution. And I just wanted to make sure, because we talk about safety tools and having an understanding of what's allowable and what's not at the table at the beginning of the book, make sure that that goes throughout. So I kind of look at the book as a whole as the managing editor and say, okay, let's make sure that, yes, we have the correct punctuation and periods and bullet points, but also let's make sure everything's formatted in a similar way. Let's make sure the content warnings or any of those pullouts are appropriate to the adventure. Let's highlight what it looks like on the page to make sure that it makes sense to a GM. And GM clarity is a big part of that, which kind of applies to all adventures, not just the Unbreakable anthology, but that's my role as the managing editor, is to make sure it looks like a cohesive book at the end of the day.
In that vein, I mentioned it again previously, but I will mention it now that you're here, and I'm fortunate enough to do so. I'll say it to your face, which is bloody well done, right? Because I've got to say, I've read a lot of stuff that talks about X cards and, you know, big lines and veils, and says, look, here is how you're supposed to do it. And it's usually, if you're lucky, it is usually a page after the introduction and before the rest of the content. If you're unlucky, it'll be sort of tucked into, you know, DM tools near the back or in the index or whatever, but it's there. And I think people, to a greater or lesser degree, have realized that not doing this is wrong, right? So, you know, the box is ticked, move on. But something I genuinely enjoyed, not just the standard of consistency and in the writing and other things like that, which I think is part of what most folks would consider to be a professionally edited publication, but was the fact that as I came to the top of each adventure, I had a meaningful, consistent experience of understanding what the type of adventure this would be, how I would engage with it, what my players, and thinking first about my players and what they're going to enjoy themselves, what things I might need to think about or change or modify or just make them aware of, right? What the scope of it was and what themes were addressed in it. And I thought that was a practice what you preach in the structure of the document, which is something you don't often see. And I just want to say, well, bloody done, because that's like it's nice to see it. You don't see it that often. So you don't have to say anything if you're embarrassed by it, but I appreciate it.
I appreciate that. I've been playing TTRPGs for over a decade, and that's something that I always look for. Don't make me dig to find out that there is, you know, maybe something that strikes the gore list that I have put out to my players, or like don't bury the lead that no one has parents, thanks Disney. You know, those sorts of things. I don't want to have to read the whole adventure and get super excited about it, and then get to the end and go, oh, I can't run this with the people that I think would be excited for this. I want to know that up front. I want to know what I'm getting into. And if I get, partway through the synopsis and I go, nah, this isn't for me as the GM, but I'd love someone to run it for me, I stop reading. That's what I feel like everybody kind of wants and nobody ever gets.
Yeah, no,
in TTRPGs. So
hang on, it's a great job. Like I say, it's exactly that. And so, like I said, even in one of them, there were a couple of adventures that I read, and I was like, I'm not sure I'd want to actually run that. I'm not even sure I want to play it, but I genuinely appreciate the fact that it's there, and also appreciate the fact that as you read through it, you've managed to strike a fine line between learning things and being lectured at. And I think that is especially when we're doing stuff that falls into, let's be honest, right? We sit in a niche category as it is, and then we sit inside a niche category inside that niche category, right? And the majority of our niche category, the broader one, isn't interested in getting to the end of their day, sitting down at a table in a garage with their friends, and then being made to feel like they are bad or not good because they want to play the game however they've grown up playing it based on the TV and the media they've consumed. So it is a fine line to walk where you bring our cultures to light and you celebrate them, but you don't actually make it a comparative history story. On that line, where do you draw that line? How do you find that line?
I will say for a lot of our writers and artists even, and including our editors, a lot of our contributors, when we usually start opening up room to invite people in for contributors for whatever position, we do get a lot of, especially since we get a lot of Asian diaspora here. And so, but then we have also received, contributors from overseas, from outside the continental North American region. And we've had a lot of people have asked us like this whole bit about like, am I Asian enough? And we just go, the only character we care about is, do you as a person identify as Asian? Whatever that means to you. There's no genealogy here. There's no need for us to do a background check. We just need to know, do you identify as Asian? That's all we care about. As long as you culturally identify as Asian, that is all we care about. And which is really something that we home in for our message to, especially a lot of our mixed race contributors, because we have a few of them as our contributors, and we encourage them to come on board with us because there is another experience that is unique, and we want to make sure that those are represented as well. So that was one of those things early on, even from volume 1. We had people approach us and ask us that question and ask us about that, and our stance since then till now and forever, as long as you identify as culturally Asian, you're always welcome with us.
That's a very exemplary stance, I think is probably fair to say. And I think Fifth Wisdom in the chat just mentioned as hooray for not making people qualify for their heritage. And I think that's a wonderful way of expressing it. Hooray indeed. Actually, on that line though, having gone from a really celebratory and slightly fantastical D&D 5th edition first anthology, what took you down this slightly more I don't want to say Shadowrun, but there's an element of like of Shadowrun that whether or not you like it or not, right? Like it's fun. I'm older than dirt, mate. So it's like, but from a but what is it that took you down this sort of revolutionary uprising path? I mean, I loved it, right? But why I'm asking the question in two contexts. One is it does put people into a polarizing situation of, do I want to introduce this concept, regardless of whether you like it or not, or where you stand on it, because honestly, there really is only one place to stand on it, but put that aside, regardless of where you stand on these things, you may not want to introduce it into your, bread and butter table game. And I think that's sort of, so in the context of that, so what took you down this road, and how's the feedback been?
So I will say that I think the theme, if I recall, I think Jazz and Caroline have to clarify for me. It was definitely one of our meetings, and I definitely came to the conclusion that one of our themes should be revolution in the context of being loud and proud about being Asian, especially since, like, I know at the time we were getting a lot of there was definitely a lot of context especially in like North America about Asians and their stereotypes, and we really just wanted to break out of that mold. And so we said, this is our way of breaking the mold and saying we do not adhere to this rigid imagination you have of us as Asians. And this is us basically saying we've had enough and we want to make a stance for it. From that concept, then that's how we got Revolution.
I also think like part of it came through because I don't think I'm trying to recall back to them. I don't think we like came up with the 4 books until we got pitches. The process started from we knew we also wanted to have not D&D games, and so when we were having a call for pitches, we're like, hey, we were still accepting 5e pitches, but we're like, hey, what is your we asked for the pitch, we asked for what systems you'd run it for and all of that. What we got was a lot of people actually were submitting these, like, and we saw the themes that like there was like a good chunk of people that were like fight the power, right? And we're like, that is awesome, and we're so proud of them for like coming forward with like such a strong pitch. It just so happened that a lot of them also happen to be indie systems because a lot of our, especially like our overseas designers, a lot more are involved in like indie RPG system communities more so than D&D, and we all know that like D&D also has some like inherent colonialist problems as a whole. So like I think that's why a lot of the Revolution themes gravitated also towards like not D&D. We ended up getting inspired by the group, and then Jacky was like, yo, we should just call this Revolution. We're like, that's awesome. And then we found out that it was actually very hard to categorize some of the Revolution ones because they were also a lot about food. So we were like, but we did have some more food-centric ones that we put it into the Pathways book. We did get a lot of 5e ones, and then we put those in like in volumes 2 and 3, which are coming out after Pathways. Those are your 5e books. So if y'all are craving some Unbreakable Dungeons and Dragons, we got you.
Yeah, I think people are definitely craving more Unbreakable content in general. But Joe, who's a member of our show, actually, has just mentioned the Singaporean culture is very much about food, and we were talking about how Asian culture is very much about food in general. But I think food and Revolution also probably have a significant relationship along the way. I mean, it's sort of the concept of the role of food in the who gets the good bits and who doesn't. There's an awful lot of what it means to I mean, just even to pick a particularly French reference, like let them eat cake is sort of comes to mind just on the top of my head, right? So, but yes, zoning into this themes of uprising and struggle, it's hard to think about these without then obviously talking about colonialism as a as a backdrop, as a front drop, as a side drop, just as sort of part of the major themes of certainly the last sort of 500 years of history directly, but also just let's be honest, right, of history, full stop, right? And so how did a lot of the stories specifically were clearly oriented towards either a just slightly pre-colonial or post-colonial Philippines, or an India that was perhaps dealing with colonial struggles at that time. How did you balance up the conversation about what colonialism is with the reality of the world, which is not just European colonialism that's to be had a good stern look at. There's an awful lot of in Asian colonialism, all by itself. Not to mention, I mean, you can just pick a place, right? So, did you think about this? And if you did, ... question mark.
That was something I had. That was definitely a thought that came to me very early on, because I'm culturally Chinese, so I'm aware of how much China has a lot of influence over Asia in terms of colonizing and being an empire at one time. I knew that could definitely be, those were themes and things that could happen. And so we definitely wanted to treat every instance of when we were talking, especially with colonialism, that it wasn't trying to empower colonialism. That was the one thing we didn't want. We wanted to make sure that this was all about the fact that regardless of culturally, whoever performs the colonialism, that this is about the freedom of the culture and about uplifting the culture. And so we wanted to make sure that was more of the focus than anything else.
It's possible. It's unlikely, in fairness, because if they're on this channel, they're probably somewhat aware of what's going on. But it's possible there are folks that just drop by and they're like, "So what's wrong with both the traditional kind of like ways that different cultures are represented in D&D, and also like, isn't colonialism solved? Haven't we solved this problem now? Isn't it done? Right? Like, there's no one's got colonies. It's all fine now, isn't it? And why are we playing this? In our game? I realize I'm begging the absurd in the question, but I mean, it's a point of view thing, right? Or even more so, you get to the "what did the Romans ever do for us" conversation, right? And so, how do you and do you feel the responsibility even to address these things?
I think that whole like colonization is over thing has become more of like, we still feel the lasting effects. It's very much like a ripple effect that hasn't gone out yet because it hasn't hit the bank. I think the colonization now is more of like people taking over these spaces. I'm sure if it hit your Twitter trending at some point, there was a group of white folks that have decided to make trendy designer mahjong tile sets that were incredibly overpriced, and they were like not at all like, it wasn't great. So that's like colonizing that space, right? Colonizing that game. They're taking it over and like reclaiming it as theirs. There's that also the whole kanji episode.
That kanji one.
The kanji green one was quite good. Actually.
Yeah,
it led to a very long conversation about the fact that kanji is actually a Tamil word. It comes from South India.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, so hang on, who colonized it first? Is that a Chinese colonization first? But anyway,
it's wild, right? But it's the fact that it's like, especially like the higher. Historically,
actually, Caroline, someone in chat JR was asking, what's the kanji about? Would you mind telling that story while I find some WD-40 to squeeze my wheels?
I believe there was a woman. I forget where she's from. I feel like it's California though.
Of course it's California.
No, it's from the New England area. Caroline.
New England area. Even better.
And their name was actually Karen, which actually just makes it funnier.
So Kanji Karen decided to make her own take of kanji after spending some time in China, and then literally just made it. It was, if she didn't call it kanji, it was her own rice pudding, right? It was just like rice pudding with like blueberries and extra healthy organic stuff, like all the buzzwords you can get. So if she was just like, I have really neat rice porridges that are super healthy, whatever, didn't label it as such, right? Sure, like inspired by it, but she said this is the better kanji. It's the fact that she like labeled it as kanji and is like it's better and healthier and all this other stuff. Like that's the TLDR. But if you look up kanji Karen on Google, you'll find a lot of the stories and takes on it.
My other personal bit is that the kanji from China didn't fit her palate. And so she literally repurposed kanji to fit her palate in whatever methods was deemed appropriate. And then when trying to make it into an influential thing for content purposes, it became, okay, I'm going to just use the term kanji because that's what it is. It's like, you could just call it what it really is, which is it's rice pudding.
Rice pudding, yeah, rice pudding. Nothing wrong with rice pudding. We all like a good bit of rice pudding now and then, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but that's that whole deal. That's the context there.
So she literally whitewashed the rice, is what you're saying.
Quite literally. It's already washed. Why do you have to make it worse?
Oh man, some people don't wash rice. What can I say?
Oh my God.
We don't.
We all respect what you're cooking, depending on where it's from. Some does call for that extra starch, so I'm not going to touch that. But I wash my rice personally. But circling back, I think it just comes from like that mindset. Like that's the colonization now. And speaking from like the North American standpoint, we're even still seeing like a lot of our indigenous peoples are even trying to like their air, like even though we have reservations, like it's their land and this is American specifically, we're trying to do this whole like stopping pipeline still. Like that's like it's actually even a little bit more like capitalist colonization versus just like, and which is inherently a little bit like predominantly white, a white space because that's just they created the system and et cetera. So that I think it's those sorts of spaces that we're trying to reinvigorate with a new perspective on like, hey, maybe it's not so cool to like do XYZ thing, and then like in terms of like the class, like breaking the classic, really like the old like stereotypes of like ninjas, samurais, and honor and all of this stuff. I mean, Asian Represents crew does a whole great thing on like the honor thing and had their whole read through of Oriental Adventures from the second edition. They did a reading. They didn't do, and they did three. They did both books, right?
They did second edition, and then they did L5. They did Legend of the Five Rings,
Right,
the new version of Legend of the Five Rings, because if they had read the older versions, they would have screamed.
Yeah, but I think I don't want to. They do a wonderful job dissecting it. So if you need more of like those incredible details, go through there. They literally read through the book and have some of the people on. I think Jacky, you're on a few of them, right? On like the character.
I am on the. Yeah, we do Asian Reads Car Tour the first Saturday of every month. Out of that 300-page supplement, we are currently on page 20.
So it goes into a lot of detail if you want that. But I think what we're trying to do is to be like, hey, not everything is like your Arthurian adventure, and also like your like dragons don't all look like the four legs of giant wings. We got our incredible different shapes. We also, it's not always like a kingdom, or like pirates aren't always like Blackbeard, like especially with like Days of Powder, right? We got some incredible like perspectives from like seafaring countries, not just necessarily like people that just claim to just jump on a boat or whatever. And we have so many different kinds of boats, and some are better for certain things. And it's a matter of like, here's a perspective, and you're just missing out. Essentially, you're missing out if you're just like boxing yourself in what especially D&D has presented to you. I think I saw in chat a little bit a while ago is like, what is our take on the UNT? I personally have a problem with inherently evil races in general, because that's a whole other bag that we can unpack.
In our homebrew world, UNT, well, firstly, everyone's a mongrel, but putting that mongrel side, it's primarily you're mostly human, and you've established some traits, and therefore that makes you, like this race or that race. But putting aside the ancestry and culture side approach to things, we don't really do evil by like there's no biological predeterminism. So,
exactly.
But let's talk about the D&D UNT.
Right. The D&D UNT is just like, see, I also even know it's like their temples are also like Mayan indigenous, and I just can't like, I don't know.
It's the most amount. It is definitely one of the D&D races that got the most amount of cross-pollination of cultures in terms of how they how it was created. It definitely blended like at least, if not close to 5 different cultures in terms of its concepts. The way the temples are done, the way they do their societal system, the way they do even their own creation is inspired from like 2 different cultures. It's just like, what is going on with this?
I think that would be fine in my mind.
Yeah.
I like syncretism, but it would be fine in my mind if the civilization actually had any oomph to it. As in, what I mean by that is like, cool, here's the civilization that exists, and it's like, yes, it's got Mayan temple. They look kind of Mayan-ish, and but there's only so many ways to build a ziggurat, right? And then you kind of go, okay, cool, and then those things look sort of like that, and those behaviors are sort of like this, because hey, I mean, like I've been DMing an awfully long time. I've stolen a lot of shit from a lot of places, right?
Oh yeah.
It's just the fact that then sits inside this like niche little bubble, right? That is the one,
right?
And there's nothing else to it. It's not like it's now they sit here and look, there's some gravity associated with this culture. So everybody around it, here's some metaphors and things that appear in the language of the surrounding villages or the surrounding places, or here's something that shows that there is any substance to this rather than just it's a collage. If you will. But
I think my biggest like thing with the UNT is like it's naive, not as like I don't really have a good word, but like before my early days, I was like, the UNT are so cool. They're like snake people. They do cool things, right? And then they have like cool powers, and they do like weird rituals. And then you get into like, you bite into it, and you're like, oh, this feels so icky, and you don't know why in the beginning. And then as you like learn your ways of the world, and as we like play this game as adults, you're like, oh, there's some like really iffy parallels. And I think it's like the idea of villainizing that really comes from it, because like, especially like, and we were talking about like colonization isn't just like the Americans and or the English technically and all of that, but like you see them, they manage to like repeat, like it's a weird reflection of how the creators and the stereotypes of the time are on the UNT, and then we get that thrown back at us and be like, okay, yeah, maybe like it'll convince people that like others are bad. The xenophobia, it's like this xenophobia plus I get it's hard to explain in a way, but because it's incredibly weird and complex, but also plainly like yucky because like we experience that kind of thing. But yeah,
it's the othering. It's the other.
Yeah, it's really the othering.
So yesterday, I because some of my players, as always, have made some brilliant decisions, and they've appeared in a certain place, and that certain place is a callback to an awfully old game I played a long time ago, set in Sigil, which is in the setting of Planescape, which appeared many years ago in mid 1990s. Standard D&D stuff. So for AD&D, there's obviously problematic things in AD&D, but I loved Sigil, always have, always will. And things I liked about it was that it was one of the first settings. Planescape was one of the first settings where actually your race or culture didn't matter. There was no predeterminism. If you were an orc shopkeeper, you'd be sit down with a pit fiend and an elf and a deva, discussing the news of today, because what was more important, it was a bit more like about the fact that, well, we're all in Sigil, which very much reminds you of living in New York City in the same way, right? And so, yeah, right. So I don't give a shit, man. Get out of my way. I'm going to bodega. But the point remains is that inside all of that became very apparent to me that they've spent a lot of time thinking about the different philosophical outlooks, and they've pulled from different societies and cultures and influences to create these different philosophies that are kind of like competing with each other inside Sigil, or if not in competition, certainly are the core of the game in many ways, the politics of the game. And that was in 1994, and they did a great job of it. And so I find it hard to excuse the sloppy jobs as a result. Do you know what I mean? It's like Planescape was such an interesting and involved concept where both the art was interesting, but the actual level of thought that went into creating philosophies that blatantly stole from philosophies all around the world and then put them together into something that was meaningful, aligned all these different things. Kind of, it did bring back, happened after stream, I was thinking about it last night, kind of going, you know, that kind of means that the rest of the times they were sort of mailing it in, especially afterwards. Like it's before I get like, okay, and there was a comment we had in our Discord that well, Planescape learned from the failings of Spelljammer. Sweet, that's awesome, right? But then all the stuff afterwards didn't learn from the awesomeness of Planescape, and I'm kind of confused by this. So why does this happen? Why do people get it?
I will say for sure, like especially for Planescape, it was near the tail. It's the tail end of TSR.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, so that's one part of it, because once Wizards of the Coast bought it in right around 2000, new team, new writers, but there was very few veterans from TSR actually in Wizards at that time. So you had a new generation of writers and designers. So it definitely was starting from scratch all over again for Wizards of the Coast when they took over for third edition. I will say for AD&D, especially near its tail end, like it did improve. There was improvements made, but it definitely took. They've had a lot of false starts. They had a lot of rough starts in the beginning because Karator had Karator. We're still going through it. And it there.
So for those who don't know, for the people who don't have sort of proverbial sort of ancient D&D beards or otherwise, or like you lot who are clearly just far too young to have been around the first time. What is it about Karator or these other settings that is just so? And I know you have an entirely separate series, and we'll link that somewhere. But just quick summary, if you could.
A lot of the problems in Karator emphasize the concepts of Orientalism, in the sense that it either exoticizes, fetishizes Asian aspects of Asian cultures. There is also the reduction of Asian cultures, either by blending other cultures, time periods, and there are also the sense of othering. So basically, this perspective that this either geographical region or culture is air quotes foreign and therefore different. And then there's also the elements of the fact that especially for Orientalism, the notion that Asian cultures are treated as or portrayed as being either savage or underdeveloped and are in need of some sort of savior concept. So that is usually the portrayal of it, and a lot of that. So as we've been reading through just even the beginning parts of it, I've read Karator second edition years ago, so I still remember how vividly dense a lot of the Orientalism can get, especially when, for example, the region of Bawa, one of the writers who wrote that region had actually done extensive amounts of research and actually had compiled massive amounts of actual papers and text for it. And it got reduced to a small little blurb in the book, in the final product. So as we've been reading through it, as for me, rediscovering, and for some of my co-hosts for Asian Reads, we've found that a lot of it, there's a lot of editorial choices that are very inconsistent. And it has like that feeling that there wasn't a central vision and it was just kind of hodgepodge together, because different sections felt like they were written by different people and they were kind of just hodgepodge together. So that's one of those aspects of, if you had a consistency editor like our lovely Jazz, and being able to organize the information in a meaningful way, that definitely helps. But I will also say that it definitely has that element of issue where, for that book especially, it has a lot of elements of Orientalism being very rampant. Then it also has a structural issue of the fact that there was no central vision, and that the organization of information is just woefully underdone compared to future releases or anything that they've done before that.
So post-Second World War Japanese fetishization and the fetishization of katana and stuff is a well-known problem or issue that happened, But why did it then carry on into Al-Qadim, and why did it carry on into all of these other settings? What is it that there is about? Because obviously there's a desire to import things from other. Because let's be honest, right? Like, it's a game that started off in Milwaukee or somewhere that I'm completely unfamiliar with. It's like in the bit.
I'm not. I lived there.
Well, you should tell me what's wonderful about it, and the stories and legends and myths and the food.
I can talk about food all day.
Yeah, wonderful. I too. And so along those lines, right? So given that these are places that are very far in many ways, both in terms of distance, but also in terms of perhaps the cultural mix and everything else, I find it hard to blame people for wanting to bring the things that they find exciting from those cultures into their games. So let's say we roll forward to today and you're still in Milwaukee or somewhere equally, unknown to me, Spokane or somewhere, I don't know. I'm picking. I have a long-standing joke with a friend of mine that Nebraska and North Dakota are basically the same place, and that is
They
primarily.
They're basically the same place.
Actually, they really are the same place.
I literally am saying that in order that Kayla gets annoyed at me rather than anything else, right? That is 100% the only purpose of that. They're different places. I'm sure that people and the cultural heritage of Nebraska and North Dakota are substantially different. But if you are in that place and you are watching The Last Airbender, or you're watching, Raya, because let's be honest, you're probably not watching things that folks here in our channel watching. How do you bring those things into your games? Like, regardless of what game you're playing, whether it's 5th edition or you're playing another game, or you're playing, how do you find those things? Other than, of course, going to DM's Guild, getting your copy of Unbreakable Volume 1 and Unbreakable Revolution, which you should do. And that's not because I got any skin in the game, but honestly, because it's worth doing, right? But putting that bit aside, how do you bring those bits in that you're interested in? It's like, oh, cool, I saw this awesome thing in, this anime I watched, or I saw this great thing in this movie, or, I just want to be like Kenshiro. Like, how do I bring that into my game without someone else showing up and it just becoming an act of politics rather than a act of fandom?
Yeah, the line is pretty. It's weirdly, it can be. I don't want to say the line is thin, because there's room to play. I think it's a matter of like, what are the intentions behind it, right? Like, is it completely just like a stereotype that is for, like, a lot of the times, like in old school Hollywood, the Chinese man was like sometimes used like the butt of a joke, right? Like, and the way that they do the extra accents, right? That's that while uninformed, and also just probably like during the time, but also just like it coming from this place of like, that's just how they are. I think that is where it's like we start being like, that's not cool, or and things like that. Like, that's really like that line. But if you're coming from like, I want to like it's not even like honor, but I'm like, I think it's really cool that this is a thing. As long as it's coming from this like more genuine place, sure, it's always going to be hard to dissect if someone is doing it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. And that's why we always get into these things of like these long Twitter threads and diatribes on people when we find out certain things about them. I think that's what the biggest thing is that there is nuance. And as long as like the interest is genuinely there and that it's like being respected in a wonderful way, like that's why I think like Ryutama comes to mind because Jazz had mentioned it earlier, but like Ryutama looks like it's like a fun, like I love playing JRPGs like as a video game, and Ryutama is like made, and it's also great to get it from the folks that like it's from. Like Ryutama is made by a Japanese author. It was written in Japanese first. It had to be translated, and so like I think it's also just like if you get it from the people that know it best too. They're speaking for Ryutama.
There it is.
I think that helps to make sure that it's not like, as long as you're respecting the sources, the authors, the cultures, I think it's fine. There's room to play and room to do that sort of stuff. Like it's hard to like have a blanket statement, I think is really what it comes down to. And we love the interest and stuff like that. And it's really neat to have like people wanting to, you know, explore being a samurai. Like Ghost of Tsushima, incredibly like, it was done very well, even though it was like mostly white studio, but they worked with why am I blanking on the very famous director's name that they worked with for this whole game?
Oh, you mean his estate? Yeah. Yes.
But like Ghost of Tsushima,
it's Kurosawa. It's the Kurosawa.
Thank you. Oh my god, I was like really brain farting on it. Kurosawa.
Yeah,
like
it is.
Like,
that's a good example of like of somebody who's not Asian representing in terms of like the studio and the culture there, and trying to because they are actually specifically mirroring and paralleling a specific film style and film and the stories that Kurosawa used to tell. But the idea is still they did bring in cultural consultants, and the fact that they do have I believe for pretty much most of the principal cast, like most of the cast are Japanese identifying in culture. So you know, and they did both the English and of course they had their own. They had a Japanese crew do the voice lines for the Japanese audio as well. You know, that's a good that is one of a good representation of somebody trying to go, okay, we really love this one thing and we want to do it right, and we also want to do it well. And that's kind of always been our internal philosophy as a publishing house as well, is if we're going to do it, we want to do it well, we want to do it right, and we want to do it at least in one go if we can help it. So like I always feel like if you are genuinely, like as Caroline says, if you're genuinely like wanting to bring something in, it wouldn't hurt to spend some time to look into it and learn about it, because that empowers you to understand some of the nuances that you may not be aware of. And that can like, especially like if we're going to use like Avatar: The Last Airbender, for example, you know, a lot of the fact that all the different nations are inspired by real cultures. And so you want to spend some time to actually learn about those real cultures, and then you can start making the connections of like where these elements are being drawn from and actually connect with them.
No, I think that's a good point. In fact, Rara in our chat has pointed out an interesting but quite nice actually description about the fine line between appropriation and appreciation. You might want to wear a kimono in the street, and we probably encourage you to do so. Just do it properly if you're appreciating culture. But making a spandex brand and calling it the kimono brand is perhaps
that
missing
Kim
the point.
Kardashian. Speaking of colonizing spaces.
That was great.
Actually, whilst we're on chat, I do very much want to get back into some themes in Revolution, but there are a couple of things that clearly came up in the course of that conversation I want to talk about. And you're all experienced role players as well as you know, your day, night, and evening jobs in doing putting this out, as well as your own sort of skills and disciplines, but which is great, and we're loving having you here. And so one of the questions that came up, still staying in the old in D&D vibe based out of Unbreakable Volume 1, did you feel conflicted about assigning a D&D race to the inhabitants of any of your Asian country-inspired stories? Because it feels like it makes sense for there to be a sort of a common, you know, concept of race in the very basic sense, but then that might be also equating, for example, you know, a certain people from a certain region to, you know, gnomes or elves or otherwise, and that leads to all kinds of fun, doesn't it?
Volume 1 very similar to the way we accepted pitches. Like they are all independently written. We didn't actually. It was actually kind of the way it played out and the way we ordered the book plays out to a really interesting campaign if you play it front to back. But they're all like individual stories, so we didn't actually even prescribe like a common race of Asian or whatever it was, and we left it up to the author to provide context for like the people in this area primarily, you know, worship these deities or do these sorts of things. And I think they saw when appropriate for their adventure, they introduced particular creatures or made new creatures because they were always there. They just rebranded for D&D for the most part, but there are some new ones. But I think we left that up to the author to decide like how do elves interact, if at all. And I think I don't even think a majority of the Unbreakable Volume 1 stories really cared what you played, as long as you like came to meander through their story and respect what's being presented in front of you. I think that's one of the best parts about Unbreakable Volume 1 is that it's like it can just be inserted into like your current running D&D game. Now, how to insert it can come off as like, oh, we were visiting this new place or whatever. So like we asked the authors to provide context of like where they would run into like this sort of thing, etc. But yeah, I think that's like one of the key things is that for the really D&D stuff, we're not like prescribing any sort of like setting. Now, if we come up with our own setting, that's a whole other story.
Oh,
but
is that something is that a thing? Is that
that has been on the
kicked around?
That's been kicked around as an idea.
In that conference call because I got some input for that. So
okay, we'll definitely write you down for that because we have a few people we have on our list to contact for that. I will say it has been something that has been asked at least about to us, and we've thought about it, and I think the one thing we're trying to decide on is how we want to approach it. We've seen it done many times of like how to do like of how, you know, especially for like a lot of the other bigger TTRPG companies where it's just like, here's a setting. It's like, okay, let's dial it back. And then I think that was the one thing we all said to ourselves, like, let's dial it back. Let's think about this and try to be meaningful with how we portray this setting, as opposed to just slapstick it together and then just toss it out to the world and say, have at it. And we want to do something that's a little bit more meaningful, a little bit more respectful, and have more nuance to build from than what has been previously done.
One of the things
for Unbreakable Volume 1, I'm having a hard time thinking of any adventure that features an entire culture of a different race/species, as has been pointed out in chat. They're almost primarily human.
They are. But that is part of also in many of the ways, especially in Unbreakable Volume 1, a lot of those stories are set in the sort of the fictional Middle China kind of concept, right? Where it is, one, it's human centric, and then spirit is the other domain, and second is sorry for the interruption, but one of the things that I wanted to bridge into this question was, is there a danger of creating a setting that is just as culturally imperialist as the sort of like the Nordic setting, in the fact that with the way that Wuxia, and sorry Joe, I'm saying it wrong, I apologize, and Xianxia are these sort of very Han Chinese dominant sort of contexts that kind of really just, yes, they have all these cool things. They have cultivators and they have levels and all this awesome stuff that everyone loves. But actually, when you look at it, it's just as much of an imperialist act of colonialism that kind of wipes out all of the other cultures nearby into this sort of generic kind of perspective. None of which, by the way, is a negative to our friends at Xianxia D&D who are currently running their stream right now. Well, awesome. If you aren't watching this, you should be watching that. But sorry, Karen.
I will say that is something that I personally think about a lot, especially since I am culturally Chinese, as I said, and I'm fully aware of the history of China's imperialism. So that is definitely one of the things that I've internally said to myself, that I never want the setting to be centrally China if we could avoid it. Like, that's really what I don't want. But also I want to actually showcase, if we ever do the setting, I would definitely want us to focus on places within the setting and actually highlight them, as opposed to just going, here is this one all-encompassing power, and then there's these little surrounding territories. It's like, no, I want us to focus on the regions, talk about them, actually give them life, make them unique, and that sort of thing, as opposed to going, okay, there's all these things that are happening, these interconnections. Like, well, why don't we focus on what's important about the one area, talk about the things that are great about it, talk about the things that are about it, but maybe hint at the interconnections and intersections that they have with other places, and that could help build something more meaningful and something real. Because when you think about a region, right, when you think about like anywhere, you always like to focus on one or a couple places and then look at them and then see how they work within the grander scheme of everything else. I just thinking that because as someone who travels a lot, and I'm just thinking about like how I always like having those old like travel books where it's just like, here's everything you ever want to know about this one particular region. And you just get to see all the details, the nuances, the history, at least the brief bits of history, right? And then you can, and I kind of, if we ever do it, I think that's how we would approach it, by region, and allowing like letting the intersection of different cultures and see how they work together.
It's definitely like a big challenge. Like, it's hard to do. It's not definitely like we don't have an answer, and I think that's like part of like, it's gonna be fun to figure that out, but also definitely like, ooh, we're stepping on some Legos right now. We're like trying to step around them, right? Because it can hurt. And we see that it's even like a challenge if you're focusing on one country, like the islands of Sina Una, for example. That's a lot of islands that you have to like represent in a matter of like a consumable. I think they have like 7 islands, but also like a myriad of different like linguistic cultures, regions, etc. And especially because they're also trying to do the decolonized fantasy Philippines, right?
Yes,
and
right,
like, where do you go? Like, it's so hard to, because we don't have like a lot of the sources aren't available. How do you do that even within like a pretty like widespread island culture? Incredibly difficult in that scope, and that's a way smaller scope than Asia.
So let's bring this into a bit of, as I'm sure someone said, let's have some real talk, right? Which is how commercial is this? Now, I mean, like from a practical perspective, as much as I and our wonderful viewers who do hang out and like you chat things, like enjoy the stories we tell and enjoy the stories that you've helped us tell, it doesn't strike me as that is the core mainstream commercial place that the TTRPG community inhabits, and certainly not the ones that are in the gaming community, and not the ones that are in the broader context of what gets published. I mean, whilst it is nice to see a few things come out of Wizards of the Coast, and oh yes, well they've managed to have same sex or same gender relationships, and they've managed to have a few other things sort of crop up. It's neither the norm nor is it anything other than, oh well, that's good, I'm glad they acknowledge that people like me exist. Beyond that, I mean, how commercial is it? Because at the end of the day, many of these things only become real, as we talked about earlier, the capitalist system exists, only become real when they are viably commercial.
I think early on we had that discussion as well about whether or not this was going to be commercially viable, whether or not this was something that people would genuinely be interested in. And then one of our contributors came up with a brilliant retort, which was that the example was, this was right around the time when Crazy Rich Asians just came out as a movie and had such a blockbuster success. And that movie generated a lot of there were a lot more people who didn't even know the book existed, who were Asian, primarily Chinese or otherwise, that just went, there's an Asian, most all Asian cast movie. I need to see this. And so they all just, so I think...
But by Asian, you obviously mean North American diaspora Asian in this context, right?
Mostly, for North American diaspora, that was definitely,
I'm pretty familiar with Asian.
That's true. So like for like the North American diaspora, it was definitely like, oh my God, I get to have representation. And I think for a lot of, especially for those who go through the diaspora, representation is such an important aspect for us because it is so Eurocentric white most of the time, and we do want to see ourselves in stories and being able to have ourselves, our children, and anyone else later than us to see that you can be a part of these stories, that you can have a voice, and that is very empowering. And so that was definitely something that when that feeling came through, that was more at that point, not just a desire to make this a commercial success, but also to basically say, I think it's time we updated the norm. We don't want to just blow it apart. We just want to change. We want to just update it and modernize it and just, be that voice of just saying, we're here too. And we want to have ourselves represented in stories that do not belittle us or fetishize us or demean us or just reduce us by blending.
No, I thoroughly and at a deep level appreciate and empathize with that, because I genuinely remember the first time that I started to think about my characters as being brown rather than white, as in it was a lot later into my role-playing career than I feel comfortable, sort of like, I look back on it with some small level of shame, because hey, I'm Asian. But from a practical perspective, it's sort of, there was a certain point where I was like, oh well, yeah, no, my characters actually look and act and represent me with my voice, rather than an elf or a dwarf or a this or a that in the conventional construct that was created. So I think that's a really, really powerful and important thing. I can't echo that enough. A couple of questions from the chat though. Continuing on the sort of like elves and the races, is that specifically in Unbreakable Volume 1, it was about, were the Imperial forces meant to be a particular race to create some dynamic or the other?
I also don't think that was specified though. I guess it's more like you can decide. I don't think I'm trying to think back on Unbreakable 1. It's been a while. We're looking at like.
Sorry, we're talking about everything but Unbreakable Revolution.
Which is totally fine. No, we're here for it.
It's fine. It's fine. No, it's fine.
To go by it. But yes.
Yeah,
I think I know which they're referring to. There is one, because there's a few that refer to like a magistrate or an emperor. So I will say that for that, we kind of, that one we left, it's more left to the GM's discretion, less so than what is prescribed, because I know for Daniel Kwan's adventure there was a magistrate, and there's really, you can tailor that to fit whatever you really want. I know I think it was originally written as human, but I will say that for a lot of the imperialist powers, I think the element that we wanted to emphasize, especially if there was an imperial power, that it didn't also try to create another sense of othering if we could avoid it. And so, but I will say that there in a lot of pieces of historical fantasy, like there are obviously going to be races who are who usually become a monolith, and they will develop into this kind of power structure. But I think that's the other thing that we also wanted to address too, was that just like the nuances with the Yuan Ti and everything else, like there's no need to have a monolith for what is good or evil. It should, especially when you think about how in real life cultures and nations are formed, it's not just one monolithic group. It's usually it's several joining together to form an identity. And so that's how I think it should be treated.
That's a very complete answer, and I think Jo was saying she wasn't trying to pin you down. She just wanted to know if there were particular things or features. That does lead me as an interesting segue back into some of the stuff I wanted to ask about Revolution, which is a lot of the stories in Revolution there's a moral relativism to them, and I again came back to that point to compliment Jazz for the way that the editing is handled, in that they are. It's pretty clearly put up front, which is, hey, this is a morally relative story. There's not necessarily a good person or a bad person, right? And that's an important point to make. But there is a lack of, in some cases, a clear goodie or a baddie, as I would have said if I was 5 years old, right? That's obviously a conscious choice. Is that something that is good for gameplay? And how does that fit into, is that a choice about the reason why you stepped away from D&D 5th edition? Like, talk a little bit about the moral relativism within Revolution.
I think, at least my personal perspective, and the idea of the moral relative, like, obviously, I think what comes to mind is make the instrument of peace, right? Where you are part of the secret revolutionary organization, but you're actually kind of helping the Spaniards because you're like, you're playing a part in like having a card, like putting a card in your hand to make sure that you have all the tools at your disposal for when you're actually able to like overthrow it's understanding the historical context as well, right? Like it happened. We can't change it. And while we have like these smaller battles that we can fight in there, it's still, historical fiction. And we have to be able to approach how the past went in order to realize where we're going now and where we're coming from and how we can draw parallels in order to not repeat history. And I think that's kind of why there isn't a clear, from our perspective in real life, Spain was kind of awful for doing the colonization, right? But I think if you're going to put it in that scope, it's just kind of like, well, they were dealing with that at the time. And also, if you look at it now, on both for better and worse, like Filipinos have ingrained a lot of like Spanish culture. Like that is part of where we come from now. So I think it's a matter of like that balance of understanding our roots, be it far back as the colonial or pre-colonial times, or even like during these revolutionary times. It was a huge factor in the way our cultures have played out the various forms of colonization and otherwise, right? Like I think it's just something that we have to acknowledge happened. And I think that's why we don't lay it out as like bad colonization sucks, but like that's just the truth that like this happened.
That's a good point, and it's arguably a wise position in some ways. I want to take a slightly different bit of a left turn here and talk about the art, specifically the use of color, because the use of color is fucking awesome. Like it genuinely is. Like it's saffrons and sort of cerulean blues and vibrant greens and colors that evoke sort of elements of the sensory experience of living here, good and bad, that are so nice to see. Now, was that something that you like, but both you, Jazz, and you, Caroline, did you like choose to turn the knob up to 11 on that, or was that a thing that you just kind of went, okay, artists, do your thing, and just magic stuff appeared and it was all good? Because there was a certain, the use of the palette throughout the book is also consistent in the way that many other things are.
So my personal graphic design taste is that there are too many games that are like, especially video games, that are just sepia tone and dark and you can't see anything. So that's just kind of like that's like a practical motivation for me, is like we need color. But like I think on top of like food and stuff, we like there's a diverse amount of colors as there are peoples in the world, and in order to like represent a spectrum of people, we have a spectrum of colors, and not even just from like a labeling standpoint of like the stereotypes, but like we all use different colors to represent different things, and it's just it's bright. There's no better way to represent it, and you have to depict these things, because even if we wanted to change it to like, oh, we should make it beauty like dark and gritty and like it's like hardcore game, like it doesn't do any of the culture service to just represent it in this like gritty fashion, right? I think that's like where it comes from. And also I personally, when it came to like the art itself, I gave the artists assignments and they ran with it. The only thing I had to do was assign people, give a couple of like, I gave a couple of critiques here and there of like people that were asking certain questions that were a little bit more technical than even like conceptual. They worked with their authors very well to like get the correct like vibe. I barely did anything, so I let all of the contributing artists were amazing. In terms of like the layout to keep it cohesive, I think personally it's very important for me, as I work in like I have like graphic design and a user experience background, that it does be a cohesive product. And then that's like makes it usable. And so that's why we also have our template with like, content warnings and stuff like that, all like a consistent front page that isn't like the art, right? Like you have your synopsis background like that. We wanted that to be consistent. And so I made sure to pick a lot of font choices, and the colors are very deliberate and more muted, while still not being like, it still is like, a little bit of a hint and nod to like the way like the D&D manuals are laid out, obviously, despite the fact that we have different systems. But we're organizing it in a way that has like a very consistent hierarchy, so that you know what you're getting. It's the color choices and that kind of like font size and font choice is definitely like more of a consistency and usability thing. The font choices and stuff are like, oh yeah, they're like, it's like right behind me. Like we use this font everywhere because it's like a very like bold headline kind of style, but it also like gives the vibe of like, yeah, we're fighting something. It's cool. I think a lot can be conveyed through just even like simple choices like fonts, and that's
I
kind of
fully agree.
yeah.
We can spend
Yeah.
hours talking about kerning if we want, but we're not going
yeah,
to.
it's like totally.
Yeah.
It was kind of funny, like
I don't know about you.
kind of like a weird tangent too. Though was like I was making I don't know what like but like took over me, but like in volume 1 I made the titles the same font. But in this one, I did like title cards with different fonts and stuff for each adventure. But I'm like, this is because that these are, I think it adds to like incredibly different stories, and it helps along with the art to give the different vibe of like the movie you're getting into. Because a lot of these adventures are pretty cinematic too, if you like are envisioning in your head. So
I think it also came from when I originally pitched the idea of Revolution and Pathways that we wanted to treat it like a giant, big RPG magazine. So we wanted every story to stand alone, be unique, and have its own identity. So that was definitely a part of that.
So yeah, and I think you definitely managed to have the sort of there's a comic book style in sort of the style. There is a strongly stylistic element to it, which I think is great. Actually, I think it's really I'd say even more so than the first one. The first one was it is an anthology, and it's very much about the adventures. This has a style through it which carries you through from start to finish, even if you don't necessarily enjoy every bit of it or want every bit of it or sings to you. The reality doesn't matter because the style brings a whole cohesion to it. We're not going to spend hours talking about the merits of design because otherwise we'll get into Norman Dawes. But now, along those lines, though, I think one of the things I did want to ask was the stories in this anthology are oriented at non-D&D games. Although that, in fairness, as I said when I was reading through it, there's very little about them, other than maybe, I think, the Gunslinger one. It's from Sword and something, and I'm not familiar with the game.
Oh, it's from Gun and Slinger and Sword and Bearer.
Thank you, Sword and Bearer and Gun and Slinger. And with the exception of that one, where some of the mechanics might make, well, I mean, you may need to spend a whole 15 or 20 minutes figuring out how you're going to adapt those mechanics to your game. But there's very little else that's going to stop you taking, especially the narrative portion, the cultural portion, and the stories and the art into your system. If it's 5th edition, that's great. If it's 2nd edition, it's great. It doesn't matter, right? You can easily transport things. But is it a direct decision to not make these aim towards the mass market, if you will, of the TTRPG space? And is that a commercially unwise choice?
It was a choice. It was okay. We've done D&D. We, the three of us, play a lot of indie games. And we're like, we know that there's more indie people, there's more voices that we want to bring to the forefront. And we want to also hear from not just the folks that write D&D. Our next book needs to be non-D&D systems. And largely they're even non-D20 systems. And that is absolutely was a choice. And I'm glad we did it that way. Is it economically viable? It's been out for how many weeks? 2, 3?
A couple weeks, yeah.
There's a different audience, and Jacky's talked about this, you know, because I did question the same thing. I was like, can we sell a book that has literally 7 different systems in it? And the answer is yes. Literally we can. Because if you think about it as an indie consumer, I buy a lot of my stuff on itch, but I buy a lot of stuff also on drive-thru. Because I want to try out new systems. And I'm constantly looking for the new thing. And I'm always looking for, I've read the book, but I don't want to come up with something on my own. Is there something that I can buy that's just a module? So me as a consumer, this book speaks directly to me, and it is a different audience.
It is a different audience because I will say that in the indie space, there are now more people interested in modules that you can slap into any kind of system, especially, and if you can write them to fit different kinds of multiple systems. A lot of like the D20 based ones or old school revival ones or OSR based ones, because they're very centric to the D20 system, they are easily adaptable. They easily get molded, and you don't need as much information, which is why like Days of Powder, Plunder and Plot, like it's written for Black Hack, but Black Hack is an OSR system, so it's most largely a D20 based system. So as you saw when you did the review, it's very adaptable. You can fit into a lot of you can fit into any kind of D&D adjacent system, and it will work fine. versus Pam's was a scenario written specifically for a given system, which is Forged in the Dark, which is for Forged in the Dark, it's basically the freer version of Blades in the Dark. So Blades in the Dark is basically about you being scoundrels and basically committing heists. And that's really what the whole element is. And so Pam, they adopted the whole element of heists into a different kind of narrative structure. And because it still can work in that same kind of framework. And it's very hackable for that reason in the indie space. So we wanted to showcase that Asian stories can be fitting, that can fit in other places, and that that we do have a place among the indie space, and as well as showing that those stories can work in any given system, and that there's no excuse.
No, I think, as I said, it doesn't take a lot of effort, honestly, to look at any of these adventures, read them through once, and then go, cool, okay, well, I don't have that in my system, so I'm just going to use this instead. I mean, it's just it didn't require a huge amount, even for the furthest away. The question was really based from is the reality that people are going to see this wonderful work, if they're not actually looking and filtering by 5th edition, content in, and it sounds like yes is the answer, which is more power to you.
Yeah, it is. That is something that people have looked at. There have been, I will say, 1 or 2 other publications that have done something similar. But I will say that their follower base, their base is a lot larger than us at the moment. But there is a market for that. They do sell it well, and so I said to myself, if they can do it, I don't see why we can't. And I thought back to also when we put up the idea of Revolution Pathways as separate things, but I looked at it as how where you have magazines with different authors coming in to write different elements of a story. And I thought to myself, why don't we treat this as not only just as a anthology, but treat it like how a magazine is treated, where there's different authors coming in to bring their perspectives into it. And this is how I want to treat it. So this is like a hardcover RPG magazine, if you want to treat it like that.
Well, actually, it was interesting because I was reading an old, because of random research on Planescape the other day, I was reading some old Dragon magazines. And I was thinking, what might be interesting is an Unbreakable magazine. Where
another thing we have kicked around, believe me.
Yes. We've kicked that around a lot.
And I suspect the overhead of running a magazine is rather brutal.
I mean, we're learning how it's being adapted with Matt Colville's Arcadia, right? Like, there's an audience, so
there is an audience.
More viable, yeah.
I will say that is very viable. That because it's digestible. So if anyone who hasn't checked those out, like Arcadia is basically Matt Colville saying, so since Dungeon and Dragon are pretty much the magazines are kind of defunct and non-existent, I want to make my own spin on it. That's pretty much what Matt Colville did, and so. There are they invite several prominent D&D designers throughout the community space, and they have them pitch articles based on around a central theme. So all the magazines always have a central theme. So if you don't like that theme, you don't have to buy it, and that's the nice thing. So it is definitely very nice. And there's different kinds of content. There are things from short adventures, long adventures, story hooks, organizations, NPCs, magic items, like new mechanical rules, like alternative rules and things like that to expand your gameplay. It has a lot of different functions, and that is an offering that is fantastic. I love it.
Yeah.
And I would love to one day see that for us as well one day.
Yeah. To circle back on these other system things, an example in what we also wanted to do with Unbreakable is essentially create this publishing platform to uplift these voices. So on top of just having content in these existing system space, we have a few game designers amongst our ranks, or that are adjacent in our circles. Like Gun and Slinger, for example, is made by a group of South Asian, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. Creators. I think Sword and Bearer is.
Well, Sword and Bearer is written by Viditya. So Sword and Bearer was a supplement for Gun and Slinger. So Viditya Valetti is a South Asian designer. So, and actually, so when Charu wrote the adventure, you got that nice collaboration of a South Asian writer collaborating with a South Asian designer using their supplement for our anthology. And so you have a lot of connection with the cultures and bringing that forward. So that was something that was a very nice thing that happened for us that we were very happy for, and we were cheering on for the whole time.
Yeah. So on top of like the stories is like we get to also uplift the systems, and in Pathways we have like 2 more authors that we brought on that also designed the games that they're writing for. So like we also get to advertise and like uplift their game systems, and then get more people playing those game systems. And then you have people like, oh, they also wrote this thing in Unbreakable. So it's like this interesting like ecosystem of like, if we like scratch our back, I scratch mine. And it's not even coming from a place of like mutual help. It's also just like we thoroughly want to be, we're proud of the things that our communities are putting out. And so like it's a great way to like work together in that sense, and work with like marginalized game designers, right? Like we have in the next anthology we have an adventure that is a sword lesbians adventure, right? Like there's sword lesbians, which is like an awesome system, right? Like it's wild. So we get to also then like be like, hey, we're diverse creators with our own voices, but there's also like diverse game systems. Like we're trying to help groups, especially because like there's, to take it like into a money standpoint, like if you write for the open license version of D&D, and then if you write for like DM's Guild, especially if you write for DM's Guild, there's like some money and licensing that you got to take out, right? Like, and we're trying to also like break into this space that's like, hey, the money isn't all going to one thing. We also want to like decentralize RPGs.
So going back on the platform bit. So one of the other goals for us as well was to, besides uplifting Asian voices and creators, is actually to give them the platform to get into the TTRPG space too professionally, because we believe that the only way we're going to really resolve the whole issue with representation is by having more Asians in the space doing professional work and offering their services, be it writers, editors, or artists, to give those lens of perspectives. And so by doing so, we're giving them a space to do that in, and the opportunities to do that in. And then also, I live under the wonderful influence of passive income through all my royalties that I do through all the work, through many of my own personal projects, but also through a few other projects I worked on. And so the other framework is we want to build this as a place for as a financial jumping off point as well for our creators, as a place to start building. And if they wish to continue working with us, they can build a backlog for royalties and then continue off of that, because our belief is that not only should you be paid up front for your services, you should be paid on the back end if we can.
On that note, we're sort of we've got about 10 or so minutes left, so I'm going to run around in a quick circle and ask you guys what is your one? I know it's going to be hard for you to answer this because it's like which of your family do you love the most, but what is your one favorite thing or your most enjoyable memory or the thing that you like the most, other than, of course, finishing it, because that is every creator's actual thing they love the most. So
not really actually even done.
I'm taking that one off the table, right? So like, put that one aside, right? So oh my God, I got it done. Put that aside, right? And it's like, what is your one thing that just shines out to you as, yes, actually, you know what, of all of everything else, that thing sings out to me from Revolution?
My favorite thing consistently has been every time we read a new pitch. Every time I get to get a glimpse into, this person has decided to write something out. It's 50 words, it's 100 words, it's 500 words. It doesn't matter, because the way that the adventure is portrayed in the pitch always makes me excited. I don't think I've read a single pitch so far that I haven't turned to these two and gone, this one's my favorite.
Yeah.
And I genuinely mean it. Like, I know I said that for the last 5, but like now I just read this one and this one's also my favorite. And I just kind of, I get that exciting feeling when you just like read something for the first time and you get goosebumps and you get chills. Like it doesn't matter to me, if that's ever, I would love to see it realized, but that is the excitement that I get every time, is when I read a new pitch and realize that author has a vision in mind and I want to bring that to life. So if there's one moment that I can point to and go, that's my most exciting point.
There's one moment, it's all of them, is what we're basically saying.
To be fair,
great answer.
It's
We've
not
gone
all
through a
of
lot
them.
of pitches. Yeah, we've gone
Yeah.
through a lot
I
of
don't-
pitches though. Woo.
Yeah. I think I actually like this is a tangent, but I actually don't think we've like straight up denied any pitch, and that's kind of
Nope.
where we came out with 4 books this year.
Right.
Like we're like, we need all of these. And then yes, we might have bitten off that we can chew more than we can chew, audience, but we're working on it. We still got 4 books. We're still gonna do it.
That's the part of the process that gets me
Yeah.
the most excited, because everything else takes effort and takes work, but that's the time where I get to just be excited. I don't have to think logistics, right? I don't have to think about does this fit the SRD, and does this all fit on a page, and is there art? Like those are all things that have to happen.
Yeah.
And I enjoy those too, but there's that moment where we all open up the pitch document.
It's the moment
we
of
all get to
potential,
read.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that excitement and that just like pure reading it for the first time. You know how you always have that book that you're like, oh, I could just wish I could go back and read this for the first time again.
Yeah.
That's that feeling that I get every time I read a new pitch.
That's
So if
wonderful.
you've ever pitched Unbreakable, just to let you know, you're my favorite.
Jazz is your biggest
If
fan.
somebody did want to pitch Unbreakable, how would they do that?
We have a form. I'll
Well,
go dig it up.
it is also on our website at unbreakablerpg.com. My favorite bit will always come to when Caroline starts doing the preliminary layout, because that's when I get to enjoy seeing all the labor of all, because so we actually get to see all of the writing. I get to see all the writing, all the art getting filed in every time. I'm always linked into everything regarding the feedback from our editors and sensitivity readers. So I already know everything that's going on. But what I really enjoy every time is when Caroline's doing that preliminary layout where the art's the rough patches of art is put together, the text is being organized, and I can already start envisioning what the final product is looking like, and I can just enjoy the fact that everyone's labor is coming together and to produce something wonderful. So it's that it's like watching something bake, and you're at that phase where you just put into, like, if you're baking something, you put it right in the oven, you just know that you're near the end, but you are just savoring this moment that all the work you put into it is about to be completed.
Yeah, I think mine is somewhat similar. Granted, I'm the one putting it together, so maybe I have like some bias. Like I'm putting that layout together. But we get the art obviously around like a little bit after the stories are being drafted. We have a channel in our Discord where the artists, like, I encourage the artists to like, hey, drop your work here. Let's hype each other up beforehand, or even ask for critique, or like brainstorm and bounce ideas off each other. And I think it's when people post their work and like, it's done, and I take a look and I'm like, wow, it's so beautiful. I love this art. Oh my God. That's obviously my bias as the art director. It's like when you read the pitch for the first time, it's like when you see the art for the first time, I think it then comes to like, when I see the art, I don't know, like I know what the adventure's about. I haven't read them as thoroughly as like Jacky and Jazz has at this point, for what it's worth. I read them enough to like put the artist briefs together, and like, because I know they're not complete. So like, I know generally the vibe, and then I look at the art and I'm like, the artist has worked more with the author and the adventure than I have. So when I see that, I'm like, now I got to go read this. And I think that's like my favorite part with that when it comes to that. So it's like a way, it's like I get a sneak peek into like, oh, without being like the spoilers of the story. It's like a teaser trailer for me for a movie, because I didn't read the whole thing. I only got a little bit of like screen caps and art, and like, sweet, now I'm gonna go in and like really read it when it comes around. And then I do end up actually having to really read it from like laying stuff out. One of my favorite things out of the book in particular that I will say is I was very this is a weirdly nerdy layout thing, but the make the adventure where every playbook and then every
I remember that moment.
Every like method that you used to go in fit in a column perfectly. Both in the black and white print version and in the book, even with the art. Like, that just like made my day. I'm like, look at this like perfect like columns of each of these things, like a playbook, a column, a playbook. It's like perfect. That's just like one of those like, oh, layout.
As I said, I'm a huge fan of both the art and the layout of and the design, and the way that it is a very accessible and sane publication. I'm literally flicking through it, looking for one particular bit of art that I'm trying to remember. It's from The Prize. It's a rare and iconic image, and I really was quite struck by it. And I keep coming back to it, not necessarily because I look at it and think of the oh yes, I love that art style, or I love this, or I love that. I come back to it and just think that it is a strong image that represents a story in a way that I find fascinating. And I think that is, there's so much of art like that in the book, and I commend you on it. And so I can absolutely understand why you find these things very enjoyable. We're coming towards the end of our time, and I want to ask you, leave you with a question I'm sure you've answered 1,000 times before in many ways, but it's obviously an elephant in the room in some ways. What are your thoughts on the Critical Role effect?
I am a Critical Role fan. I'm just not and I enjoyed it. That's kind of what, I mean, I was playing D&D for a long time before that. And I was always playing from a little bit more of a tactical combat game standpoint, because I enjoy those type of games as well. And D&D does lend itself to that. Some people do theater of mind. My group was very grid heavy. The bad things that come out of Critical Role is everyone's held up to the expectation that you have to be a professional voice actor and do voices and act, when that's not the only aspect of tabletop RPGs. I also think it's I think its effect on mainstream media in terms of putting tabletop RPGs in the forefront is pretty healthy for a lot of us probably wouldn't be designing if it wasn't for D&D coming up, right? The D&D renaissance is real. We cannot deny that fact. And I think that's a positive for the gaming space in general. And it brought a whole lot of people in. And while yes, the cast isn't particularly diverse, the way that the world is presented is pretty diverse in Critical Role. Those positive things that I like to have that have come out of it are great. And I think what it did is put an emphasis more on narrative in these games, which you can see that Wizards is leaning into, right? You can see that a lot of the way we write our stories is a little bit more cinematic narrative, and we try to not be as mechanics heavy sometimes, even in our 5e games. So I think those things that actually put the role playing aspect, I think Critical Role really highlighted the role playing aspect, and I'm obviously sure there are groups that have done off screen what the Critical Role group has done, right? But I think it also shows in a very fantastic celebrity ways that this is it's entertainment, right? This is a space that is it's a weird sort of video games or art discussion, where it's is watching people roll dice around a table entertainment? Yeah, it can be. And so it can and you guys do it here too, right? It's interesting to see that we're becoming it's broadening it's just adding more voices, I think, and that's what's creating a very healthy creative space. Obviously there are negatives with gatekeeping and stuff like that, and then rabid fandoms, but that's a whole other discussion, and kind of separate of the role playing and the D&D thing in general. And I think also they have evolved to start flexing their platform, utilizing other systems for their one shots and stuff like that. So, and not just parading D&D around, but obviously Wizards could not be happier for the free advertising until they started paying Critical Role. So it's a whole swath of things and very complex.
I had the chance to say this to Matt Mercer at one point, because he was at Gen Con running a panel, that the reason that I became a DM is because of Critical Role. I had been playing games. I'd been playing 3.5. We'd played Pathfinder. We weren't so sure about 5th edition. We don't talk about 4th.
I think 4th edition, well, it's a conversation for another day, but it's an unfairly bad.
It was unfairly treated.
Unfairly badly.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that was also not the people I played with. So that was the at the time that I started watching Critical Role, I didn't think that I was tactical enough to be a DM, because I had someone else look over my character sheets, even if they were done in Excel and auto-calculated. I had someone look over them before I started a session. So Matt, as a DM, showed me that you don't have to be tactical. You can be more narrative. You can be more improv. You can really lean into that character side. And I think I started watching Critical Role within the first 10 episodes of season 1 because it was on Geek and Sundry, and I was a big The Guild fan. And I remember talking to my then boyfriend and being like, hey, there's this new show they're playing D&D. It's on Geek and Sundry on Felicia Day's channel. You want to watch? And that really is what got me into being a DM. And then within just a couple of years of being a DM, I wrote my first adventure. And because I wrote my first adventure and that's the one that got published in Uncaged, I'm here today. So say what you will about the commercialization and like the fandom that's come up and, you know, all of those issues that do surround Critical Role as a media. There are a lot of people that come into D&D and tabletop role-playing because Critical Role made it something easy for them to watch and therefore easy for them to enter into the TTRPG space that I don't think a lot of us would have. And Matt gave me that confidence through the screen in order to become a DM. And now I'm the managing editor on 2 books and 3 more coming. That's my Critical Role story.
So I also have met Matt personally. Also, for anyone who doesn't know, Matt's actually
so jealous.
He also signed my books too. So let's not start. Well, I will say though, because actually Matt Mercer's family is actually in the same state as mine. So we're all based in Florida, which is weird. And oddly enough, I found out recently that I was more or less 3 to 4 degrees removed from Matt in terms of playing D&D from way back in that time period. And in the early heydays, I will say for me, I remember watching Geek and Sundry's the first week of podcast, the first week of their Twitch stream. And when they said that they were going to do D&D, I said, I actually had been out of TTRPGs for a couple of years at that point. I actually left the space. I left the community. I was pretty much gone. And I said, well, it's been a while. Let me pick this up a little bit. I think the only thing I did before that was like listen to a few podcasts every so often, because back then actual play podcasts were really a new thing and they were, and people were really eating it up. And then, and I knew on Twitch, before Critical Role, there were already streamers on Twitch that were doing actual plays, but Critical Role definitely helped elevate the Twitch platform for actual plays, because this channel, many other channels since then exist because Critical Role literally made it a thing. Yeah. So many other people have all attempted to pull that model of success in varying degrees. I will say that for the space, Critical Role has basically brought that mainstream gaze onto like TTRPGs and D&D. Like Caroline has said, it helped. It definitely the extra free advertisement didn't hurt for Wizards, and then that gave them enough space to build that little renaissance starting up, and it brought back other TTRPGs that have been very quiet for many years as well, that have been kind of out of circulation or have been kind of just sitting out on the wayside. Like we got back World of Darkness because now we got 5th edition for Vampire, and we're getting Werewolf soon, and that means we're getting other systems to come following in that genre, in that family. Other systems like Chaosium with Call of Cthulhu, other systems were coming into the forefront, were already coming back. Then now we're getting newer systems that are making big headway, like Blades in the Dark, as we mentioned before. It's actually getting its own TV series. It just got, the article came out on Polygon yesterday. So John Harper, the creator, is probably very excited to have their game being used as the central focus of a TV series. That's the power that Critical Role has given to the space. There are some qualities of it that haven't gone great, like Caroline and Jazz have stated, but for all the bad, the good that it did helped everyone else, because I will say I also wouldn't be here if it weren't for Critical Role, because a lot of designers now, especially myself, we got early in on DM's Guild, and then that helped drive us and motivate us. And some of us were able to fully leave the space. Some of us are still making headway in that space. And so we all chose I think the ability to choose our own path of how to be a designer has largely to do with the way Critical Role has given everyone else the capability to do so. Now we see things like Zine Quest every February, March, where on Kickstarter you're going to see indie RPGs coming out with like small little magazine, like small little zines that are 15 to 25 pages long, that are a full self-contained game. And that is literally a great way for indie designers to build themselves up, give them the confidence to actually build their games, make it bigger, better, and give them a start. And we exist also now to give others a start. And so that is really one of the best things about it.
That is, I mean, many things you said all echo and resonate with us. I think very few of us would actually be here without Critical Role, probably still be playing the games we play them. And certainly your point, Jacky, echoed a lot with me, which had mostly been not doing much in the way of TTRPG things until it sort of inevitably became the star in the system that kind of drew me back with its gravity. So on that note, we're pretty much ready to finish up. I'd like to know from all of you where, if people were interested, other than, of course, unbreakablerpg.com, where would they find you, and what kind of things would they find you doing?
So yeah, you can find me on Twitter at ClineAm right here. I'm mostly on there. I talk about mostly video games lately, and then I shout about Unbreakable on the rooftops and retweet all my mutuals. I'm stream on Twitch. I've been in chat. I am /NillyLine. It's also on my Twitter profile. So I stream. I'm actually streaming later tonight, but it's not here. It's gonna be early morning for y'all. So I stream on Twitch on weeknights, and I typically also during the day I'm a software engineer, and I talk about coding sometimes. And sometimes I'll also be retweeting a couple of BuzzFeed things, because I'm a software engineer at BuzzFeed. So that is what I do.
These are 10 things I have to know about you now, right? So
yeah, exactly. Fun fact that technically BuzzFeed didn't come up with the listicle. We just popularized it.
Yep.
100%. So I'm mainly on Twitter, which is Orange Lake Jazz, which you can see right there. That's me pretty much everywhere, with the exception of being Itch, where I am under Sunken Rest Games. It's the co-studio that I run with my spouse, where, as I just mentioned in chat, we were talking about food, and I totally forgot. My big indie game is Great British Bake Off themed. Where you get to, someone plays like the host / the judges, and everybody else plays baking contestants.
You're playing with fire with taking melons too. Taking melons too and turning them in. You're playing with fire here, but do carry on.
Great British Bake Off, the RPG, kind of, yes. It's a simple enough RPG that I taught both of my parents, my in-laws, my grandparents, I believe, have also played it, and I think folks as young as 8. So it's a very TTRPG light. You have 3 stats. It's very easy, but it's zany. It's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy that game a lot. It's called Ready, Set, Bake, because I couldn't use Great British Bake Off.
Right, indeed.
And Bake Off is trademarked in the US to Pillsbury. So
it is.
I am also an editor for hire. So I currently do not have a day job and have not for 3 months unintentionally. So please, if you have anything that you need edited, from a resume to a TTRPG book, please let me know. I have rates. I'm happy to work with anybody. Caroline says I'm the best editor. That is untrue. I am not the best editor, but I think I'm pretty good. So
and again, as I said before, based on the content of the book and the layout and the quality of it, the work speaks for you.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And I'm going to pass it to Jacky.
You can always find me on Twitter at Death by Mage. As I said before, freelance TTRPG writer, designer, and editor. So I write pretty much day and night because I barely sleep. So I have a lot of projects I write for, but right now a lot of them are still in development or under editing or layout. You can always find all my indie games at deathbymage.itch.io. My brand of indie games vary from the whimsical things like being secret agent penguins to the more psychological horror, such as my Haunted Memories game, which is pretty much inspired by Itch Chapter 2. Also very introspective psychology-based games. So I usually write games about you analyzing your thoughts and things like that. And then all my D&D 5e works you can find on DM's Guild. You just type in my name and you'll find pretty much all of them.
I want to shout out one of Jacky's games.
Go ahead.
The Turducken one.
Oh, the Turducken one.
Because Thanksgiving is coming up in both Canada and the US very shortly, and you should run Jacky's Turducken 5e adventure. Because
for those of us who aren't from Canada or the US, I'm aware of the concept. But what is a Turducken?
A turducken is basically a chicken that's stuffed into a duck that's stuffed into a turkey. The bones are actually removed, so it is stuffed. They are three birds stuffed into each other, and it actually is originally a French dish that it was actually inspired from. But the term turducken is actually trademarked in the US, so I can't use it. But but I will say that adventure is a 5e adventure, is actually a murder mystery as well. And there are murder weapons that are sentient. So that's always fun. So it's basically, if you liked the movie Clue from 1985, it has a big Clue vibe, as well as a giant 20-foot tall zombie turducken monster that's basically modeled after King Ghidorah from Godzilla. So there's a gravy breath involved. So I'm sorry ahead of time.
How could you ever resist? And with that, I'm terribly sad to say we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. Thank you, especially to Caroline and to Jazz and to Jacky for taking the time to discuss their latest publication, Unbreakable Revolution, which is available on Drive-Thru-RPG. There's a link in the chat, but either way, there's also a Caroline, if you move to your left or right, I can't quite tell, there's a bit.ly link that's right behind you. There we go. It's a bit.ly.unbreakablerev. Thank you. You can come back now. And if that doesn't work, then just go to unbreakablerpg.com, where all of the links for both Unbreakable Volume 1, which is a wonderful piece of work, and Revolution, as well as the future bits are happening. My name is Ramji. I am the DM and general idiot that is involved in this channel, The Fourth Culture. We stream every Monday and Thursdays now, and we're very happy to have everybody join us. And if you haven't taken a moment just to hit the follow, subscribe, everything else, thoroughly appreciated. If you have, then, well, thank you anyway for watching. It's been a great time. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again.